The LG C1 OLED and the Samsung QN90A Neo QLED TV are both vying for that coveted spot in your living room, but they both have their own characteristics as well as their respective strengths and weaknesses. Well, in this video we're going to compare both their strengths and weaknesses to see which one is better suited for you. Stick around. Hey guys, it's the Villaman here, home theater enthusiast and lover of all things tech, and on this channel we review, demo and compare audio and video tech to help you find out which is best for you and how to get the most out of them. So if you're into that and you haven't subscribed yet, this is the perfect time to do it. Alright, so for this comparison, we'll be using the Spears & Munsell benchmark discs as well as my Panasonic UB820 Blu-ray player as the signal source for both TVs. The signal will be then split by a Denon X4700H receiver, which will send the identical signal to both TVs. So any differences that you see will be a result of the TVs themselves. Now we'll be comparing select test patterns as well as HDR video to see just how well the TVs perform when compared to each other. So let's get into it. And we begin the comparison with a test of tone mapping using this contrast test with ever increasing brightness, and both TVs do really well in the brighter sections and have ample definition between them. However, the Samsung does have more definition in the shadows than the LG does. This is an improvement for the Samsung, where the tone mapping wasn't quite as good when I compared it to the C10 OLED. Now though, with the firmware update, it has ample definition in both the highlights and the shadows, while the C1 doesn't have quite as good definition in the shadows as we see on the Samsung, where the two darker sections have almost no definition between them. Now we'll test how both TVs handle a bright window with an ever increasing size. And on the Samsung we can see where there are brightness fluctuations as the window grows and different backlight zones get activated, but on the C1, which doesn't have a backlight, we see where as the window grows larger, then ABL, auto brightness limiter, kicks in, and as more of the screen gets brighter, the overall brightness is reduced. This is more clearly seen if we speed up the video. This one goes to the Samsung. Next we'll test the motion handling of the TVs with a test of judder, de-blurring, and 3:2 film content pull down. In this first test of motion enhancement, there are 3 lines of text on the screen. Setting both the de-judder and de-blur settings to their maximum results in a much smoother image, with both the second and third lines being much more legible, but that comes at the expense of artifacting, which you can see on the edges of objects. Enabling these settings will be great for fast-moving content like sports, but that comes at the expense of the fast-moving objects themselves having artifacts around them as they move. So objects like a football or a golf ball would be the primary culprits in this instance. Next is the running peppers test, which exhibits judder on both TVs. However, it's more pronounced on the OLED. The QLED does have its own issues though, where the peppers have blooming around them as they are a bright object on a dark background. The backlight also seemingly can't keep up with the speed of the peppers and leaves a blooming trail behind it. Enabling both the de-judder and de-blur settings on both TVs results in the peppers movements appearing very smooth without any issues and without artifacts. The peppers are also brighter on the OLED than they are on the QLED because it does better with bright objects on a dark background than the QLED does. In this next motion interpolation test, the movement of the objects on screen appear very smooth at first glance. However, with more critical examination, we see that there's some micro judder on the OLED which isn't as apparent on the QLED. It's not enough to be distracting, but it is there. So in this test, the winner is the Samsung QLED. Next up is the backlight and local dimming test, and we'll begin this test with low stimulus content. And the OLED does really well in this particular test as it displays the low stimulus content, for example, the horizontal stripes that is not present on the QLED. Next is another test using 4% gray and lower stimulus. And again, we can see where the checkerboard pattern is evident on the OLED and isn't present on the QLED. Now, this is a really popular trend I've seen when comparing both these TVs, where on low stimulus content, the OLED performs much better than the QLED does, where it displays more of the image than you can see on the QLED, especially on challenging scenes where you have one or more bright objects on a completely dark background. Next, we'll test the local dimming zones on the QLED using my custom-made HDR full array local dimming test. As the bright square moves across the screen, both TVs exhibit judder, but it's more pronounced on the QLED as the backlight struggles to keep up with the bright square moving across the screen. And the QN90A has a total of 44 horizontal and 18 vertical dimming zones for a total of 792 local dimming zones. Next is the star field test, which is notoriously difficult for a full array local dimming TV, no matter how many zones it has. Now, this test consists of multiple point brightness elements on a dark background, and the OLED does much better than the QLED does in this instance, where on the OLED they are bright and defined, while on the QLED they are much dimmer as there is some aggressive backlight management going on to minimize blooming. If we bring them even closer, then we can highlight the differences between both TVs. As the brightness and number of stars increases, the QLED starts to exhibit noticeable blooming. It also begins the test later and ends it sooner than the OLED does. The winner in this case is the C1 OLED. Next, we're testing input lag and banding, and in the movie mode, both TVs have similar input lag, but the instant pixel response of the OLED gives it a slight advantage. In game mode at 60 Hz, the input lag for the QLED is 10 milliseconds, while the input lag for the OLED is 12.5 milliseconds. At 120 Hz, the input lag for the QLED is 5 milliseconds, while the OLED has an input lag of 6.5 milliseconds. Both TVs have very similar input lag in my tests, but the instant pixel response of the OLED gives it a slight advantage in the real world, where the image on the OLED is slightly ahead of the one on the QLED, especially if we slow down the video to half speed. We'll use this next quantization artifacts test to test for banding, and that's to see how smooth the gradients are as it transitions from one color to the next. And both TVs do well with the gradient on the 10-bit source, but not so well with the 8-bit gradient. And the QLED is the winner here, where it doesn't have quite as much posterization in the 8-bit image that exists on the 8-bit image on the OLED. Both TVs handle the gradients in the shadows really well on both the 8 and 10-bit sources, though the OLED did have more artifacts in the shadows on the 8-bit source. This ends up being a tie between both TVs. Now, an OLED and an LCD TV approach HDR from different spectrums. The OLED approaches it from a bottom-up perspective, while the QLED approaches it from a top-down perspective. And what do I mean by that? Well, the OLED is more contrast-centric, where it has individual control of all the pixels, so it has perfect blacks and okay brightness, but the resulting contrast is what gives it that HDR pop. While the QN90A Neo QLED TV is more brightness-centric, so it has a mini LED backlight which gets really bright and good contrast, so the brightness is what creates the HDR pop in its case. So the one most suitable for you would be dependent on the kind of environment you're watching in. In person, both TVs do justice to the specular highlights of HDR content, and the resulting picture emphasizes the difference of technologies behind each of the TVs. The OLED has a more contrasty picture with higher perceived saturation, while the QLED has a brighter picture with that HDR pop. And although the OLED had better representation of low stimulus content in the test patterns, with actual video, the QLED had better representation of black level detail. There are of course picture settings available to change this, but in the most accurate picture mode, this is how they compare. The contrast advantage of the C1 leads to a higher perceived saturation on the OLED, and that makes colors appear vivid without looking unrealistic. But with that said, the picture of the QLED TV still has good contrast, but has significantly higher peak brightness, especially useful for specular highlights. Objects which are supposed to be bright appear really bright and very realistic. So this is one advantage of the QLED that the OLED just can't match. Since the QLED is so much brighter than the OLED, I wanted to also see how they compare with similar brightness levels. So I reduced the brightness of the QLED to 60%. And this didn't just affect the overall brightness of the scene, but also the brightness of the specular highlights. They were nowhere near as bright as they were with full brightness, and the specular highlights on the OLED was actually brighter in most instances than they were on the QLED. At similar brightness levels though, the contrast advantage and the higher perceived saturation of the OLED is even more apparent. So I hope that's helped you to see the differences of the picture that both these TV technologies recreate. I've always said if you have a bright room, then the QLED may be the better choice for you because it has a really peak brightness, it has really high peak brightness, and it has a really good ambient light rejection. And that continues to be the case today, and it has an even brighter picture now with the mini LED backlight. The OLED has always been a stellar performer in a light controlled room, and that continues to be the case, but it doesn't have any anti-glare coating like what exists on the Samsung QLED, so it may have a bit of a hard time in a bright room. You will see reflections on the screen. Now don't get me wrong, the Samsung TV still has glare, but it's not as defined as it is on the OLED TV. So it all depends on the picture you're looking for as well as the room you're watching in. And I'm sure you can hear my dog right here. He's chewing on a toy while I record this. Now for 2021, Samsung has implemented a micro LED backlight system for their Neo QLED TVs. So this is very different from the QLEDs of the past. Now, it has 792 local dimming zones, which is a significant jump over last year and even the previous year. LG has also done a complete overhaul of their software and UI, so that's different for 2021 as well. A mini LED TV is still an LCD TV, it just has a more advanced backlight as opposed to the CFL or an LED backlight of the older type TVs. It still has multiple layers and local dimming zones to manage the brightness and the picture on screen, while the OLED TV, each individual pixel can be controlled individually, so it has infinite contrast as opposed to, say, the QN90A, which has 792 local dimming zones, while the OLED has over 8 million individually controlled pixels. So which TV do you think won the comparison? Do you agree with my assessment of which TV won each respective section? And also, which TV do you think won the picture comparison? Share your thoughts in the comments. Another thing to note is that though both TVs support HDR with dynamic metadata, with the LG supporting Dolby Vision and the Samsung supporting HDR10+, Dolby Vision is the more adopted form of HDR with dynamic metadata, so there'll be more content available in Dolby Vision than there is on HDR10+. Both TVs also do really well in gaming. They both support ALLM and VRR, of course, because of their HDMI 2.1 compliance, but the Samsung only has one HDMI 2.1 port as it has in the past, while all the 4 HDMI ports on the C1 are HDMI 2.1 compatible. That may or may not be an issue for you. That's if you're playing games at 4K at 120 Hz, and let's be real, not many games are available at 4K 120 Hz right now, so that may not be as important to you. But they both support adaptive refresh rates regardless of what HDMI port your gaming console or your PC is connected to. So if you want to help support the channel so we can make more videos like this, then I've left links in the description where you can buy the TVs if you're interested in them, or you can visit the merch store and buy awesome t-shirts like this one. Now, I've done some other comparisons, like comparing the QN90A to the C10 OLED, but I also have some other comparisons planned, like a comparison between the C1 and the LG G1 Evo OLED, as well as a comparison of the G1 and Sony's A9J OLED TV. And those comparisons led to some very interesting conclusions, I can tell you that right now. But yeah, don't forget to like the video if you liked it and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching, and until next time. This has been your friend and neighborhood Villaman saying be safe and peace.